The Nancy Drew Files, Case Number 1, Secrets Can Kill by Carolyn Keene. Chapter 6. The car picked up speed, careening wildly down the hill. Nancy downshifted to second, then to first. The Mustang slowed, but not enough. Sharp curve coming up. Darrell spoke quietly, but Nancy heard the quiver in his voice. She couldn't blame him. She was too terrified to speak. Hands glued to the wheel, Nancy guided the car into the curve, praying that she wouldn't meet another car coming up. The road remained clear, but it also grew steeper. As she came out of the bend, she could see the stop sign at the bottom of the hill. It was still 50 yards away, but in her imagination, she was already on top of it. Could see the Mustang tearing into the intersection and colliding with whoever was unlucky enough to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Amazed that her hand was steady, Nancy reached over and slowly pulled up on the handbrake. It didn't work. The car was going so fast that the brakes had burned out. The stop sign was looming up like a monster's claw in a 3D movie. There was no time to think. Instinctively, Nancy aimed her car at the soft shoulder on the opposite side of the road. With an impact that snapped their heads back, the Mustang hit the bank, went up on two wheels, and wobbled for what seemed like an eternity. But finally, with a bone-jarring thump, it landed upright. Nancy shut her eyes and leaned her head on the steering wheel. She was breathing like a marathon runner. When she opened her eyes again, she saw Darrell pry his hand loose from the dashboard. "Well," he said with a gasp, "so that's what your Mustang can do?" Nancy reached for his hand and held on tight. She felt like crying, but when she opened her mouth, a giggle came out. It was a perfectly normal, hysterical reaction, she told herself. Then she giggled again. There was a smile in Darrell's voice as he said, "How about letting me in on the joke?" "It's just..." Nancy tried to stop laughing and couldn't. "I remembered that my car is due for an inspection in 2 weeks. Now the gears are probably stripped. The front bumper has to be completely smashed and the brakes are burned out." This last thought brought Nancy out of her dream world. Her car? What had gone wrong? True, it needed an inspection, but that was just an official thing. Besides, she'd had new brakes installed 6 weeks ago. Something awfully strange was going on, and whatever it was, Nancy had a definite feeling that it wasn't good. She pushed open the door and jumped out. "Hey, where are you going?" Darrell called, rolling down his window. He stuck his head out and saw Nancy kneeling by the left front wheel, peering underneath the fender. "What is it?" he asked. Nancy stood up, so angry she could hardly see straight. "The brake cable," she said grimly. "It's been cut." "What? Are you sure?" "I don't get it. Who'd..." "Wait." Nancy held her hand up for quiet. Then she sniffed the air. Frowning, she ran to the back of the car and sniffed again. "What's wrong now?" Nancy could hardly believe what she was going to say. "That rock we went over? I think it cracked the gas tank, Darrell. The car could blow. It could blow any second." She started down the hill. "Get out of the car! Hurry up!" There were no footsteps behind her. "Nancy!" she heard Darrell call. "Nancy, I can't open the door. It's jammed." Nancy didn't hesitate. She raced back to the car and fought with the door from the outside, but she couldn't get a good grip on the handle because the door was on an angle leaning toward her. She ran to the driver's side. The smell of gas fumes were stronger than ever. "Get your seatbelt off," she said to Darrell, finally managing to open her door. She helped him climb out. "Now let's go!" She grabbed his hand. "The car's already beginning to burn," she said as they ran desperately down the hill. When the car blew, they were only a few yards away from it. The force of the explosion flung them to the underbrush by the side of the road. They clung to each other. For a moment, hardly able to speak, they stared at the burning sports car. "Nancy, are you all right?" Darrell whispered at last. His eyes were bright with concern. Nancy nodded. Feeling the heat of Darrell's breath against her cheek, she hardly noticed her bruised knee and scratched arms. It seemed the most natural thing in the world for them to keep their arms around each other. Nancy closed her eyes and breathed deeply. When Darrell had first touched her 2 days before in the hallway, she had wondered what his arms would feel like. Now she knew. They felt fabulous. But with that fabulous feeling came another feeling. Guilt. It wasn't Ned whose arms were holding her. It wasn't Ned whose lips she was feeling, nor Ned whose voice was murmuring her name. And hadn't she said just 3 days before that nobody could compete with Ned Nickerson? Well, maybe no one could in the long run, but at the moment, in the short run, Darrell Gray was doing a pretty good job of it. It was a dangerous moment, emotionally, and Nancy knew she wasn't ready to deal with it. Before Daryl's lips reached hers again, she eased herself gently from his arms. "Hey," she said softly. "Hey yourself." Daryl's blue eyes were smiling, looking at Nancy. He gave a long sigh. "So," he said in a throaty voice, "how about answering the question I never got a chance to ask? Who would do something crazy like this?" "I have a pretty good idea." Anger made Nancy's voice tight. She pulled away and felt herself stiffen. "Does the name Jake Webb ring any bells?" "Jake? Sure," Daryl said slowly, sitting up. "I can see him doing something like this. But there's no way you can prove it, is there?" Nancy was silent for a moment. She was remembering Jake's threat on the stairs, remembering him in the parking lot half an hour ago, hearing that voice on videotape. "Stick with shopping, Nancy Drew. It's a lot safer than snooping at Bedford High." Well, she hadn't done much snooping yet, but she hadn't backed off either. Had Jake, for some reason, decided to stop her before she got any further? "You're right," she said as she and Daryl got up and brushed the leaves and dirt off their clothes. "I can't prove it, but I think Jake's the one." "So what are you going to do?" "Talk to him about it," Nancy said. "First thing tomorrow morning." "Hey, Nancy, I wouldn't do that," Daryl said quickly. "Jake Webb's not the kind of guy you go around accusing of something, believe me." "I believe you," Nancy told him. "I also think he has some explaining to do." Daryl took her hand, sounding really worried. "You shouldn't mess with that guy, Nancy." "I'm not going to mess with him. I'm just going to talk to him." In a way, Nancy was almost glad that Jake had given her something to think about. It took her mind off of how she felt about Daryl, which was a mystery she didn't want to solve just then. "Please don't worry. I'll be careful," she said, flagging down the car that was passing slowly. "But Jake Webb is up to something, and I'm going to find out what it is." "I think Daryl's right," George said as she drove towards Bedford High the next morning. Until Nancy got another car, George and Bess had to play chauffeur. "I think you should steer clear of this Jake Webb and go right to the police. Show them your car. Then let them deal with Jake." "That's what I think, too." Bess leaned over the back seat and grinned at Nancy. "Now, tell us more about Daryl Gray." "You'll probably meet him one of these days," Nancy said. She stared out at the beautiful Bedford houses, trying to decide the best way to approach Jake. Daryl was the least of her worries at the moment, even though she couldn't help remembering the kiss he'd given her after driving her home the previous night. Before he'd kissed her, he'd tried once again to talk her out of confronting Jake. Nancy was touched that he was so worried about her, but she was sure she could handle Jake Webb. After all, she wasn't going to meet him in some dark alley. She was going to walk right up to him in the halls of Bedford High. She couldn't wait to see the look on his face when he saw his gruesome plan hadn't worked, that she was alive and ready to take him on. The creep. "What's happening?" George interrupted Nancy's thoughts, pointing to the wide front steps of the high school. Nancy looked and saw at least half of the student body milling around outside. The kids were talking in little clusters, waving their arms, pointing dramatically. Then she saw the police cars, one with its red lights still flashing. "Well, at least you'll have the police protection when you talk to Jake," Bess joked. "I wonder what they're here for." "Good question," Nancy said. Could Daryl have called them? She didn't think so. He'd tried to talk her out of dealing with Jake at least 10 times, but he'd never once suggested that she go to the police, which was a little strange when she thought about it. She didn't think about it for long, though. As soon as she got out of the car, she joined the nearest group of kids. "What happened?" she asked. "What's going on?" One of the girls turned to her, fear and excitement in her eyes. "It's Jake Webb," she said breathlessly. "He's been killed."